It's taken a long time, but there's finally a book on Boston as a journey from decline to revival. In this history, it's a revival brought about mainly by people from the neighborhoods, sometimes in conflict with the plans of business and political leaders, not to mention some institutions. The book's called Boston 1945 through 2015. We'd like to welcome the author, Russ Lopez. Thank you very much for being with us, Russ.
Thanks for having me.
Russ, I know this book covers ground that many people have read before in other histories, but one thing that was clear to me early in this book was all this word about disinvestment that I remember from the 1970s. It really started, even before World War II here.
Yeah, actually, I was having a conversation with Representative Byron Rushing, right? And he goes, you really, if you want to talk about decline, you got to go back to before World War I. That's when it really started. It wasn't something that just popped up in 1945. We were really on a downward spiral for almost a century before things began to revive.
Downward meaning that there were some industries that were leaving the area and people just weren't investing in anything else, I guess, right?
Yeah, I mean, Boston was famous for its textiles, for shoemaking and whatnot. And they all left really by the 20s. It was pretty much deindustrialized.
Well, right after World War II, we have what some people might have thought of as a stale backwater of provincial grudges. And then the politicians say, let's do something about this. And then what happens? You get, New York streets?
Yeah, well, I think for the first several mayors after World War II, the idea how you revitalize the city was by getting new people. Let's get rid of the poor folks. Let's get rid of the elderly folks and the kids. And let's bring in new wealthy folks. And so therefore you got New York streets and the West End, and let's bulldoze the city and let's get new folks in here.
You had a central artery, and then there was a plan for the Southwest Expressway that was supposed to terminate at the inner belt around, what's now Cass Boulevard. And then the people in the neighborhood say, first it was the West End, the South End, and then along the Southwest Corridor. They're saying, no, we don't want this.
Yeah, and I think the real strength of Boston, I mean, obviously it has a beautiful location and wonderful architecture, but the real strength of the city for all these years was its people. It was the folks who lived here. They were smart, they passionately loved their city, and they weren't going to leave no matter what.
And your book talks about this over and over again in the city. In one of the episodes that might be, forgotten by many, was the initiative for Mandela to make Greater Roxbury an independent community. It didn't win, but it had an effect.
Yeah, it actually lost 2-1 when they finally had a referendum. I think it really made African American folks and Latino and Asian people realize, it's really their city. But it was a conscious decision, right? They had to say yes or no, and they decided that they were going to stay. So I think that really made them part of Boston forever.
Well, I remember one of the things this was a reaction to was the sort of almost a shoot from the hip decision by a BRA director say, let's build this great big hotel in Dudley Square. That'll spruce things up. And of course, people in the neighborhood says, hey, wait a minute. And eventually, after Mandela, you get the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Talk about why that group is so important.
Well, it was really revolutionary. And one of the things I've noticed when I go to other parts of the country, they want to know about DS&I to this day. And I have a personal connection to it. I stayed in Boston after I graduated because I was a community organizer for a community development corporation in that part of Roxbury, Dorchester. So I have a real close love of the whole group of people. But it was saying, rather than having somebody else decide for us what we're going to have in our neighborhood, I mean, why would the people in Roxbury want a giant hotel, right? If you ask people on the street, they want more practical things, right? So the DS&I folks really were revolutionary. They said, okay, we're going to talk to folks block by block, house by house, whether they speak Cape Verdean or Spanish or English or whatnot, whether they be old Irish families or old Italian families or Cape Verde or from the South or Puerto Rico or wherever, right? We're going to see what they want. And you see the wonderful results, the housing there, the revitalization of Blue Hill Avenue, the fact that even in that horrible recession we just got out of, 2007, there were almost no foreclosures in the Dudley Triangle that the DS&I concentrated on.
This has been in news, and we're talking with Russ Lopez, the author of Boston, 1945 through 2015. Russ, one of the things I know that you and we've been sort of taking the business community to task, and yet during this period, the economy did get a lot better, if not necessarily for everybody. What was going on?
Well, I think there was a time when the economy was declining, but then so many innovations began here. The mutual fund, for example, the idea that folks could invest money of their own for their own retirement, for their own future, for their kids' education, that came out of Boston. The whole biotech revolution came out of Boston. So they did become innovative in themselves. They decided that they were going to try new things. There was something in the city that made people want to take chances and risks.
Of course, another part of your book, at the end here, you get into the winners and the losers, because it's not all one or the other. Talk about what you see mainly as the winners in this.
Well, we only have so much space, right? The city can't get any bigger, right? It would do no good to annex Quincy or Brookline or Cambridge. We're really stuck in our 40-some square miles, right? So if new people move in, unless we drastically increase housing and drastically change the cityscape, people are going to be pushed out. And the folks who are won are the high-tech, wealthy folks, right? I mean, the city is bustling. You walk down the street day or night, right? And it's just full of folks. Everybody seems happy and excited. But it also means, of course, that people aren't there, right? I mean, more and more poor people are being pushed out to either peripheral cities. We lost a huge number of people, just got pushed out and moved to Georgia or Texas or Florida or someplace, right? So it's this winners and losers. I mean, it isn't all just wonderful, good, happy times.
Of course, among the losers here, the white working class and maybe many people of color, too.
Yeah, the African-American population in Boston has pretty much been flat since 1970. It's maybe goes up a couple thousand, goes down a couple thousand, pretty much unchanged. And a lot of people now live in these places, like, not to put them down, but if you're poor, it's easier to find affordable housing in Brockton or Lowell or Lawrence or Chelsea than it is in the city now. And I only worry that's only going to get worse.
And of course, there's a bigger gap between the housing and the job opportunities in all likelihood.
Yeah, everybody wants to be in a certain small area, right? From the medical area to Kendall Square to the waterfront, right? It's that little triangle, right? You could pretty much fill it up with anything at this point in time.
One of the things that's interesting about the book, even though it's very chronological in one way, you can see how things progress. Sometimes it's from one mayor to another mayor. And talk about the LGBT community, because I was struck how you talk about the earlier history and then you have the later history. There's quite a development in terms of, I guess, the community's strength and its ability to connect with the rest of us too.
Well, that's actually the subject of the next book. It's going to be an LGBT history of Boston. But when I write a book, it has poor people in it, it has non-white people in it, it has LGBT people, everybody. So that's my kind of history. To me, one of the more interesting things is the very first Pride Parade they had in 1971. They protested conditions in bars, they protested the police, they protested in front of the State House, and they protested various religious institutions. And I contrasted that in 2015, right, where many of the bars used to have floats and they were all gone. But now you have police actually marching in the parade. You have politicians marching in the parade. And one of the biggest segments is actually churches and synagogues. So that contrast between 1971, when maybe, I believe, 100, 200 people, they say, showed up for this march, and many of them wore bags on their head because they were afraid of their employers, to 2015, only 40 years later, where you have people openly marching with their employers, right? And all these groups in it. To me, that's just a tremendous contrast in our time.
Well, one of the other things I was reminded of, too, is that when people wanted to turn a bad story into a good one, notably along the Southwest Corridor, not only did they have vision, but they were able to use political leverage. And of course, that all started with stopping I-95. And of course, talk about that, because you had Kevin White as the mayor, and then you had Sargent, the governor, and they're both competing for the governorship.
Yeah, that's before my time, but boy, I would have loved to have been a party to those various conversations. You had Kevin White wanting to replace Sargent as governor, and one of the things White did, he wanted to show that every single Democratic ward committee in the city was supporting him. So the Ward 4 folks, who were right there at the junction of where the new highway was going to go, said, well, the price of our support is going to be you opposing the highway. And by some quirk of the way it was funded, it needed city support to build a connector between the highway and Back Bay.
And this connector was pretty big.
Yeah, it was going to be 4 lanes in each direction. They weren't deciding it was going to be a high rise or built on the ground, but it was a giant thing about where the railroad tracks go now, the corridor goes now. And so they said, okay, Mr. White, if you want our support, you better come out against it. And he did. And that killed it. But of course, then Sargent had to one-up them and killed the whole project.
Now, there's one other thing here, a little demystification on your part, and I know that you had some reference behind it. A lot of us in Boston still talk about this legendary James Brown concert that diffused all the tensions and maybe prevented some serious rioting in the streets of Boston. And it's about Kevin White, persuading Brown to go ahead with a concert at Boston Garden and having it televised. And then you note that it wasn't all about Kevin White and James Brown.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, right? The rest of the country's burning because of Martin Luther King's assassination, and Boston had some unrest, but very minor compared to the rest of the country. And this idea that Kevin White called him Jimmy Brown, that was what
Jimmy,
he called
as a football player.
Yeah,
right.
And persuading him to still have the concert. Well, actually, how to put this politely, even by then, James Brown was more of a, most of his fan base was in older black folks, not in the younger folks. So, they weren't really, the idea that, thousands of people would be transfixed by a concert and stay home rather than riot, when the rest of the country was just so just burning with emotion, right? In reality, what happened is, ever since the previous year, when there had been some civil unrest along Blue Hill Avenue, Mel King and a bunch of others had been working really hard. They had identified youth leaders and youth potential troublemakers, and they went out and contacted each one. They got them together. They calmed them down. They did this tremendous work, and it paid off, right? This year's worth of work of working with young people in Boston, which is really a symbol to me of how Boston pulled itself together. That's what prevented the riots. It's not as compelling a story, obviously.
Well, as you put it in your footnotes, people can find out more about that in Mel King's book, Chain of Change. And if they want your book, I guess it's pretty easy to Google. So they should do what exactly?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and pretty much anywhere else online.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Russ Lopez, author of Boston, 1945 through 2015.